This channel's for people who don't scare easy. If that's you, hit subscribe, turn the lights down, and get comfortable. What you're about to hear might follow you to sleep. Tonight's story comes from David Lawson, a veteran trucker with over 20 years on the road. Most folks call him Big D. He's seen just about everything America's highways can throw at a driver, but nothing prepared him for what happened on Highway 50 in Nevada, a stretch known as the loneliest road in America. It was March 2021, around 3:30 in the morning. David was hauling a load of electronics, making good time through the empty desert. The sky was pitch black, not a single car in sight, just endless miles of cracked asphalt and sagebrush. He'd driven this route before, but that night, something felt off. The air was heavy, and the silence pressed in on him, broken only by the steady hum of his engine. Suddenly, without warning, every light in his cab flickered and died. The headlights, dashboard, even his phone, everything went dark. The engine kept running, but David was plunged into total blackness. He tried the flashlight he kept in his glove box, but it wouldn't turn on. It was like the darkness had swallowed up every bit of electricity. David coasted to a stop, heart pounding. He rolled down his window, hoping to catch a breeze, or maybe hear a distant car. Instead, he heard footsteps crunching on the gravel just outside his door, slow, deliberate, and way too close for comfort. He called out, "Hello? Is someone there?" But there was no answer, just the sound of those footsteps circling his truck. Then, out of the darkness, a low, guttural voice whispered his name. "David." It was so close he could feel the breath on his neck. He slammed the window shut and locked the doors, but the footsteps kept moving, slow and steady. Suddenly, something heavy slammed against the side of his trailer, hard enough to rock the whole rig. David gripped the steering wheel, frozen in place, listening as whatever it was dragged its claws, yes, claws, down the length of the trailer, leaving a screeching sound that made his skin crawl. He sat there, trapped in the darkness, for what felt like hours. The footsteps would fade, then return, always just out of sight. The voice whispered his name again and again, sometimes right in his ear, sometimes from the far side of the trailer. David tried the ignition, the lights, the radio. Nothing worked. He was completely alone, surrounded by something he couldn't see and couldn't explain. Then, just as suddenly as it started, the lights snapped back on. The dashboard glowed, the headlights cut through the darkness, and the engine roared to life. David didn't waste a second. He floored it, tearing down the highway until he reached the next way station. When he finally stopped, he got out to check his trailer. Deep claw marks were gouged into the metal, and a single muddy boot print sat on his driver's side step. Shaken, David reported what happened to the officer on duty. The man just nodded and said, "You're not the first. We call that stretch the Blackout Mile. Some don't make it through." David still drives, but he never takes Highway 50 at night, and he never, ever ignores the feeling that something's watching him from the darkness. What if the road you're traveling isn't as empty as it seems? America's highways hold more than legends. These are places where real, documented horrors unfold. Every story you're about to hear comes straight from police reports, news articles, and first-hand testimony. These aren't urban myths. They happened. Here on Verified Fears, we bring you true horror stories that have been researched, verified, and documented. I'm your host, and tonight, we're riding along with America's truckers into their most unsettling encounters. Over 3.5 million drivers cross these highways every night, and some witness things the rest of us can't explain. Tonight, you'll hear 10 chilling accounts from truckers who faced the unexplainable and survived. As we begin, keep in mind that not every shadow on the highway is just a trick of the light. Sometimes, something follows you through the storm. Wyoming's Interstate 80 is known for its long, empty stretches, but for Danny Rodriguez, a veteran trucker, one February night in 2019 would redefine the meaning of isolation. The snow came down in sheets, obscuring the world beyond his headlights. Danny was used to rough weather and endless miles, but this night carried an unfamiliar heaviness, as if the road itself was waiting for something. As he pressed on through the storm, Danny caught sight of headlights in his mirrors. One set, then two more. 3 trucks, older models from decades past, fell into step behind him, moving with uncanny precision. They matched his every move, closing in whenever he sped up or slowed down. Their formation was flawless, but there was something wrong. Their running lights were off, and their engines made no sound. Even the CB radio, normally alive with chatter, offered only static and the occasional fragment of a whisper. Danny tried to reach out on the radio, hoping for a human voice, but no one answered. The only thing he heard was a broken, distorted phrase: eastbound, never west. It was enough to send a chill through him, but he kept driving, hoping the convoy would eventually break away. Instead, the trucks stayed with him, their presence pressing in on him like the weight of the storm outside. When a rest area appeared at mile marker 250, Danny decided to pull in, desperate for a break and maybe a witness to what he was experiencing. The 3 trucks followed, rolling to a stop at the far end of the lot, engines idling, headlights burning through the snow. The rest area was deserted, the building dark, a handwritten sign taped to the door: closed until further notice. The silence was absolute, broken only by the low rumble of his own engine and the distant hiss of static from the radio. Back on the road, Danny's truck began to sputter, his temperature gauge spiking, the engine threatening to quit. He pulled onto the shoulder, watching as the phantom trucks glided past. For the first time, he got a clear look at the cabs. They were empty. No drivers, no movement inside. The name Westbound Freight Company was painted across the trailers. Danny remembered old stories from other truckers. Westbound Freight had gone out of business after 3 drivers vanished during a blizzard in 1987. Their trucks discovered with engines running and cabs frozen solid. As Danny sat stranded, the CB radio came alive again. This time, the voices discussed road conditions and truck stops that no longer existed, places demolished years ago. One voice, cold and close, said, "He'll be joining us soon enough anyway." Then, as if summoned, the 3 trucks reappeared, reversing down the highway at impossible speed before stopping behind his trailer. "Engine trouble, friend. We can give you a ride," came the offer, flat and inhuman. A Wyoming State Trooper's arrival broke the spell. The phantom trucks vanished, leaving only tire tracks in fresh snow. The trooper told Danny he wasn't the first to report seeing westbound freight trucks during winter storms. Over the years, 17 similar encounters had been logged, with a few drivers never found. The officer said, "Some roads hold on to their ghosts, and some ghosts aren't content to just haunt. They're still looking for company." Danny made it home, but he never drove that stretch of Interstate 80 again. For truckers, the road can be a place of routine, but sometimes the familiar turns hostile. And sometimes what you see in your mirrors is only the beginning of the nightmare. There are places where the road itself seems determined to trap you, as Lisa Patterson would soon discover. Lisa Patterson's route through rural Arkansas was supposed to be routine, just another delivery across state lines. But a sudden detour changed everything. Construction at the Tennessee-Arkansas border forced her off the main highway and onto a tangle of back roads she didn't recognize. Lisa, a seasoned driver, trusted her instincts and her maps, but that night both let her down. Her GPS flickered, lost signal, and then rebooted with a new route, one that led her down a narrow lane bordered by overgrown fields and battered mailboxes. The name, Millfield, flickered on the screen for a moment before vanishing. The further she drove, the more the world seemed to shrink. The radio static pressed in, and the road twisted through a landscape that felt abandoned by time. Farmhouses sat in the distance, their siding warped and windows gaping open. Some looked as if they hadn't seen life in decades, yet fresh tire tracks cut through the mud in their driveways. The air grew heavy, and Lisa found herself lowering the radio without thinking, straining to catch any sound from the outside. When her GPS rerouted again, Lisa realized she'd passed the same cow-shaped mailbox for the third time. The landmarks repeated themselves: a rusted swing set, a pile of broken tricycles, a row of children's toys caked in dirt. Each pass, the details changed. Lights flickered in windows that had been dark, and the toys looked newly placed, as if someone was marking her progress. The sense of being watched grew stronger, and Lisa's unease turned to dread. The road narrowed and ended abruptly at a barricade. As she reversed, shapes emerged at the edge of her headlights, figures in nightgowns, faces pale and blurred, standing motionless in the fields. They watched her with a hunger that was impossible to explain, drifting closer each time her truck slowed. Lisa's hands shook as she shifted gears, determined to break free, but each attempt to turn around only brought her back to the same stretch of road, the same silent witnesses. Suddenly, the truck began to fail. The RPM surged and dropped, the temperature gauge spiked, and a sharp smell of burning oil filled the cab. Lisa's rig was less than a year old, meticulously maintained, but now it felt like the machine itself was rebelling against her. She floored the accelerator, desperate to escape, and barreled through the darkness. As she broke out of the loop, something slapped against her windshield, a slip of paper pinned beneath the wiper. "Thank you for visiting Millfield. Come back soon," it read, the handwriting shaky and childlike. Lisa kept driving until she reached a service station. There, she learned the truth. Millfield had been wiped off the map decades ago, after a chemical plant explosion in 1973. The dispatcher told her she wasn't the first to report lost time and ghostly figures on those roads. "You're the 7th driver this year," he said, to mention people in nightgowns. Lisa never took that detour again. The note, later postmarked from a closed post office, and the doll she found on her passenger seat, served as reminders that not every ghost story stays in the past. Some places linger, waiting for anyone unlucky enough to wander in. For truckers like Lisa, it's a warning. Sometimes the road remembers you. And sometimes, the voices you hear in the night know more about your journey than you do. For Marcus Thompson, night driving on Interstate 40 meant relying on the steady voice of his CB radio. Channel 19 was always alive with chatter, weather updates, traffic jams, the occasional joke to break the monotony. But on a stretch of highway where the only lights were his own, Marcus heard something that didn't fit the usual routine. A voice, low and calm, broke through the static. "Marcus, you've got a problem with your left rear trailer tire." The words cut straight through him. He hadn't used his name on the air. No one could have known the specifics of his rig, let alone his identity. The voice continued, describing a sidewall bulge that Marcus hadn't noticed himself. He asked who was speaking, and the answer came back: "Shadow." The warning was too precise to ignore. At the next safe pull-off, Marcus inspected the tire. What looked fine at first glance revealed a dangerous bulge on closer inspection, one that could have caused a blowout at highway speed. Unease settled in as he realized the voice had been right, but the encounter didn't end there. Back in the cab, the voice returned, this time with details that went beyond the physical. "You were coughing earlier. Need to get that checked out. Could be your chest acting up again." The comment landed hard. Marcus had been having chest tightness for weeks, something he hadn't told anyone. Then the voice mentioned his daughter. "She'll be a great nurse. You've got to stick around to see her finish that program." Marcus said nothing. His daughter was, in fact, in her 2nd year of nursing school. The sense of being watched grew sharper, the cab suddenly colder. He started driving again, gripping the wheel tighter. As he approached mile marker 127, the voice softened. "That's where it happened. Tire gave out. Didn't have a way to stop it before I hit the median." Marcus glanced at the roadside cross, something he'd always passed without a second thought. Now it felt like a warning. He asked who was speaking. The answer: "Thomas Williams. Can't forget that name now, can you?" Later, Marcus learned the truth. Thomas Williams had died 6 years earlier. His rig flipped at that very spot after a tire blowout. Among truckers, Williams was known as the Night Rider, a ghostly figure on Channel 19 who watched over his own. The white cross at mile marker 127, surrounded by faded flowers, marked the place where Williams' journey ended and his legend began. Since then, truckers have reported hearing the Night Rider's voice, always on Channel 19, always with warnings that save lives. The details are never wrong. Some drivers say he's a guardian, a spirit who refuses to let others share his fate. Stories circulate about the voice's yearly return, each time preventing accidents that might have mirrored his own. The stretch of highway near mile marker 127 is now called Night Rider's Beat, and many drivers make a point to thank the unseen watchmen as they pass. In a world where every mile can bring the unexpected, some dangers are easier to believe than others. But for those who've heard the Night Rider, the line between legend and reality is razor thin. Not every warning comes from the living, and not every threat on the highway looks like trouble at first glance. Angela Rivera had always followed one rule: never pick up hitchhikers. Years on the road had taught her that even the most desperate faces could hide danger. But on a bitter January night in 2022, as she drove east on Highway 2 through North Dakota, the storm made everything feel different. The snow came down in thick sheets, erasing the world beyond her headlights, and there by the shoulder stood a young woman. Jeans, a thin jacket, arms wrapped tight against the cold. Against all her instincts and company policy, Angela slowed and let her climb in. The girl called herself Jennifer. She shivered in the passenger seat, her voice thin and halting, as if she hadn't spoken to anyone in days. Angela turned the heat up, but Jennifer couldn't seem to get warm. When Angela asked where she was headed, the answers were vague. A town up the road, family she couldn't quite name, memories that slipped away as soon as she tried to grasp them. Something about her didn't add up, but the storm outside pressed in, making it hard to think of anything but the road ahead. As Angela pushed through the whiteout, she kept one eye on her mirrors. A pair of headlights appeared behind them, always at the same distance, no matter how she adjusted her speed. They never passed, never fell back, just hovered in the storm, an uneasy presence. Jennifer grew more anxious, glancing over her shoulder and whispering, "Don't stop. They're waiting for us." The words hung in the air, heavy and strange. Angela tried to ask who was waiting, but Jennifer's answers trailed off, her gaze fixed on the darkness outside. The air in the cab grew colder, the heater working overtime to little effect. Angela's unease sharpened when she realized Jennifer wasn't breathing. Her chest stayed still, no fog on the window, not even the sound of a sigh. The realization hit hard. Before Angela could react, Jennifer turned to face her. Her eyes were completely black, her voice steady and calm. "You know what I am, don't you?" she said. Then, as if reciting a fact, she added, "They've been hunting this highway for 3 winters. They're always hungry." The headlights behind them inched closer, and Angela's grip on the wheel tightened. She spotted the glow of a truck stop up ahead, a sliver of safety in the storm. Making a split-second decision, she steered toward the lights. Jennifer's reaction was instant, a shriek that shattered both side windows, a sound that felt too big for the small cab. By the time Angela rolled into the lot, Jennifer was gone, vanished as suddenly as she'd appeared. The cab warmed. The smell of frost and something sweet faded, and Angela was left alone, shaken but alive. Later, police found a car in a ditch near where Angela had stopped. A vehicle buried under months of snow, registered to Jennifer Walsh, a student missing since a blizzard the winter before. Angela was the fourth trucker in 2 years to report picking up a hitchhiker matching Jennifer's description during a storm on Highway 2. Each story ended the same way, with the hitchhiker vanishing, and the driver left with questions that had no easy answers. Highway 2 has gained a reputation among truckers for disappearances and strange encounters, especially in winter. Some say there's something out there using the storm as cover, luring drivers off the main road. Angela's story is a warning. Not every desperate face on the roadside is what it seems, and not every passenger is looking for rescue. The road can test your judgment in ways you never expect. But sometimes it's not the people outside your truck you have to worry about. Sometimes it's what you're asked to carry that holds the real danger. Carl Matthews was used to unusual requests, but the job that came through late one night stood apart from the rest. The offer was simple. Haul a sealed shipping container from a private warehouse outside Memphis to a research facility in Colorado. The pay was nearly triple his standard rate, but the instructions were strict. No opening the container, no discussing the job, and if anything went wrong, he was to call a special number and no one else. The promise of easy money was enough to quiet his doubts, at least at first. The pickup site was nothing like any freight terminal Carl had seen in 2 decades on the road. The warehouse sat at the end of a long, unmarked drive, surrounded by a chain-link fence topped with razor wire. Security guards checked his ID twice before allowing him inside. The container itself looked more like a vault than a cargo box. Thick steel plates, multiple heavy-duty locks, a humming ventilation system, and a web of temperature and motion sensors blinking in the dim light. The air inside the loading bay was cold and stale, and every move was watched. Once he pulled onto the interstate, Carl tried to settle into the rhythm of the drive, but the sense of being watched lingered. A few hours in, he began to notice sounds from the trailer. At first, it was easy to dismiss them as the usual rattles and thumps, but these noises grew into something more deliberate, a slow, rhythmic scraping, followed by sharp scratching that seemed to move along the length of the container. The pattern was too intentional to ignore. At a deserted rest area, Carl stepped out to check his rig. That's when he noticed streaks of dark red seeping from the container's door seal, tiny droplets, fresh and sticky. He froze, heart pounding, as he saw handprints pressed into the steel from the inside. The prints were clear and recent, clustered at eye level, as if someone inside had tried to force their way out. The air felt colder, and Carl's nerves stretched thin. Still, the promise of the payout kept him moving. The sounds intensified as the miles passed. Then came the voices, muffled, desperate, barely audible at first, then rising into frantic pleas. "Help me, please. I don't know where I am. Don't leave me in here." Carl's hand shook as he drove, the pleas echoing in his mind. He tried to convince himself it was a trick of exhaustion or stress, but the voices wouldn't stop. When he could take no more, he pulled off and called the authorities, breaking his silence. Police arrived and forced open the container. Inside, they found only a sophisticated climate control system, scattered food wrappers, and medical equipment monitoring 3 sets of vital signs. Yet the container was empty. There were no people, just evidence of their recent presence and a sense that something had gone terribly wrong. The company that hired Carl vanished overnight, the warehouse abandoned, and the investigation led nowhere. Months later, Carl received an unmarked package containing a USB drive. The footage showed 3 people inside the container, calling for help, time stamped to the very hours when the container had been found empty. The FBI could not explain the video or the fate of those trapped inside. Other truckers have since reported similar jobs: sealed containers, high pay, and strict secrecy, fueling rumors of a wider operation that preys on those willing to look the other way. Carl rarely talks about what happened, but he warns others to trust their instincts on the road. Some cargo comes with more than just a delivery address, and sometimes the places you stop for help are just as dangerous as what you're running from. Rebecca Santos was used to finding comfort in routine, but the night she pulled off Interstate 70 in Missouri, nothing felt familiar. The sign read, "Big Jim's 24-Hour Plaza," its neon lights burning steady against the dusk. The lot was sprawling and spotless, with more open spaces than seemed likely for that hour. Diesel prices flashed on the sign, so low they felt out of step with reality. Rebecca hesitated, feeling the odd weight of a place that seemed a little too perfect, but she parked and went inside. The atmosphere inside Big Jim's was thick with a strange quiet. Fluorescent lights glared off polished floors, and every shelf was stocked with brands that looked right at first glance, but were just slightly off. Labels with fonts out of style, snacks she remembered from childhood, and products that hadn't been on the market in years. A group of drivers sat together at a corner table, but their faces were slack, movements slow and unfocused. No one spoke. The usual background hum of radios and conversation was missing. The clerk, a man with a fixed smile, rang up her purchase and offered an unsettling comment. Big Jim's has a way of growing on people. Most folks end up staying longer than they plan. Rebecca returned to her truck and found her engine dead. The starter clicked, but nothing caught. The clerk stepped outside, waving over a man in coveralls. He introduced himself as Jim, a tall, broad-shouldered man with a handshake that lingered too long and a smile that never reached his eyes. He offered to take a look, and Rebecca, wary but stranded, agreed. Jim worked quickly, barely speaking, then gave a nod and disappeared back inside. The engine roared to life, but the unease didn't lift. Before pulling away, Rebecca checked her engine compartment and discovered a small, unfamiliar device clamped to the block, tucked out of sight. It hummed with a faint blue light, and she realized it wasn't part of her truck's system. As she left the lot, headlights appeared in her mirrors, 3 trucks, all from Big Jim's, following at a steady distance. Rebecca gripped the wheel and tried the CB, hoping for help, but the voices that came back were flat and strange. "You can't leave Big Jim's. Your room's still ready." The words echoed the clerk's earlier warning. Rebecca veered off at an unexpected exit, finally shaking the convoy. When she reached the police, they were skeptical until she showed them the device, a sophisticated tracker capable of disabling her engine remotely. The investigation led to an empty lot where Big Jim's had once stood, closed and demolished over 2 decades earlier after its owner, James Big Jim Morrison, died in a wreck. The plaza had been gone for years, but Rebecca wasn't alone. Other truckers had reported similar encounters, the same man, the same truck stop, the same sense of being trapped. Some of those drivers vanished without a trace. Their trucks were found abandoned along Interstate 70, engines cold, personal effects left behind. Months after her escape, Rebecca received a postcard with a photo of Big Jim's and a message. "We miss you at Big Jim's. Your sleeping room is still available whenever you're ready to come home." The postmark was local, but the Postal Service had no record of it. Truckers say that sometimes the roads offer places that shouldn't exist, places that remember you even after you've left. And sometimes what follows you after a stop is worse than what you find inside. But not every threat on the highway comes from a place. Sometimes it comes from the cargo itself. James Mitchell's assignment looked straightforward: transport a load of antique furniture from Savannah, Georgia, to a collector in Portland, Oregon. The pay was more than fair, the paperwork in order, and the estate sale boasted items that would make any antiques dealer envious. But from the moment James saw the centerpiece, a hulking dark wood armoire covered in elaborate twisting carvings, he felt a pressure in his chest that had nothing to do with the summer heat. The figures etched into the wood seemed to shift when he looked away. Their limbs tangled in ways that unsettled him. The shipper, Harrison Blackwood, watched as the armoire was loaded at the front of the trailer. Blackwood's pale, tired face and hushed warning stuck with James. "Don't open this under any circumstances. The lock is there for everyone's protection." The man's hands trembled as he secured the heavy lock. James signed the receipt, uneasy but determined to finish the job. The first night on the highway, James noticed a pattern in the sounds from the trailer. At first, it was the ordinary creak of wood and metal settling, but soon it became something else. The noises grew sharper and more deliberate, as if someone inside the armoire was shifting their weight, testing the boundaries of the old wood. When James stopped at a rest area to check the cargo, he found the lock hanging open, though he remembered fastening it himself. The carved figures on the armoire's doors seemed to have changed. What looked like vines before now resembled outstretched arms, fingers pressed against the grain. By the next day, the unease turned to dread. Muffled voices drifted from the trailer, at first faint, then unmistakably human. James heard fragments of conversation, pleas for help, and a woman's scream that forced him to pull over. The voices began to mention his name, his wife, and details about his life that no stranger should know. "She's waiting for you," one voice whispered. "But we're waiting too." The truck's radio flickered between static and snatches of those same voices, and the GPS cycled through impossible locations, towns that didn't exist, roads that looped back on themselves. The further James drove, the more the armoire seemed to exert its influence. The truck's electronics glitched, the engine sputtered, and the air in the cab grew cold. At a truck stop, desperate for help, James called the police. When they opened the trailer, the furniture had shifted on its own, forming a tight circle around the armoire. The doors stood open, revealing a space inside that defied logic, far deeper than the armoire's exterior, filled with personal effects from people missing for over a century. Pocket watches, faded photographs, and a journal signed by Harrison Blackwood Sr., missing since 1987, lay scattered on the floor. The authorities confiscated the armoire and destroyed it in a controlled burn. Witnesses described blue flames and the sound of screaming as the fire consumed the wood. The incident was never fully explained. James left trucking for good, but 6 months later a package arrived at his door. Inside was a wooden figurine, carved in the same twisted style as the armoire, unmistakably modeled after him. The note read, "The collection grows. Thank you for your contribution." Some stretches of highway never let go of what passes through them. For drivers like James, the journey doesn't always end when the cargo is delivered. Sometimes, the road finds new ways to keep you trapped in its memory. Patricia Williams prided herself on staying calm no matter the circumstances. Years behind the wheel had taught her how to handle everything from mechanical breakdowns to sudden storms. But nothing in her long career prepared her for the night she became caught in a loop of time itself on Interstate 70 near Effingham, Illinois. The job was supposed to be simple: haul a load of medical equipment from Indianapolis to Denver, stick to the schedule, and make the usual stops. But as Patricia passed mile marker 159, she felt something off. The landscape outside her window looked frozen: rows of cornfields, a red barn with a missing board, and a dead tree warped into a claw. She saw the same scene again 15 minutes later. At first, she thought she'd lost track, but the third time she passed the same marker, dread set in. She wasn't backtracking. She was stuck, repeating the same stretch of highway over and over. Her CB radio, usually a lifeline, was reduced to static with the occasional, almost inaudible voice. The only thing that broke the monotony was the cargo in her trailer. The medical equipment began to emit a faint blue glow and a low hum that seemed to pulse with the engine. The light bled out from the edges of the container, casting strange shadows that didn't match the movement of her truck. The shadows moved with a rhythm of their own, out of sync with the road. One night, the static on her radio cleared just enough for a voice to come through. "Name's Bobby," it said, thin and weary. "You're not the first. I've been here for years, I think. Same road, same loop. Whatever you're hauling, it's not what they told you." Bobby explained that the loop wasn't an accident. The cargo was experimental, and the company that hired her had set a trap. "The longer you stay, the harder it is to get out. They want you to become part of the system." Patricia's truck began to glitch. Gauges flickered, the dash clock spun, and the humming from the trailer grew so loud she could feel it in her bones. Bobby's voice urged her to check her engine for anything out of place. On her next pass, Patricia stopped and found a sleek device wired into her electrical system, something that hadn't been there before. She pulled it free. The moment she did, the loop broke. The scenery shifted. The dead tree faded behind her, and for the first time in days, she passed a new mile marker. Afterward, Patricia's sense of time never returned to normal. She recalled every detail of the loop with unnatural clarity. The FBI investigation revealed her cargo wasn't medical equipment, but advanced technology meant to manipulate time, and she'd been an unwitting test subject. Patricia's truck showed signs of rapid aging, the metal and electronics worn as if years had passed, while she herself was unchanged. She still hears faint calls for help on her CB, other truckers trapped in similar loops, warning her about new companies and cargoes. The authorities have logged dozens of reports, but the companies behind these shipments always disappear. Patricia's experience left her changed, able to sense when something isn't right with time itself, and she knows she isn't the only one being targeted. Some drivers discover too late that the things they trust most, their memory, their route, even their own mind, can be taken from them without warning. Kevin Martinez's reputation was built on his sharp memory. He knew every route, every shortcut, and every safe place to stop. But after accepting a lucrative contract to deliver sealed biological samples to a research facility deep in Montana, his certainty began to erode. It started with small lapses, forgetting the turnoff for a familiar truck stop, missing a highway exit he'd driven 100 times before. At first, he blamed fatigue, the kind that settles in after too many nights alone with only the radio for company. But the gaps widened. He'd find himself parked at rest areas with no memory of how he'd gotten there. His logbook, always precise, filled with entries in his own handwriting about deliveries he couldn't recall, stops in towns he'd never visited. The sense of unease grew as Kevin realized these weren't ordinary memory slips. The logbook was littered with unfamiliar details, strange delivery times, routes that made no sense, even notes about conversations with people whose names meant nothing to him. He tried to piece together his journey, but the harder he worked, the more details slipped away. Paranoia crept in, a cold certainty that something was being taken from him, not just forgotten. When he reached the gates of the Montana facility, the place felt wrong. The buildings were too clean, the silence too deep. As he waited for instructions, voices bled through his CB radio, clinical, detached. Subject 47 is showing accelerated memory loss, one voice said. Extraction is nearly complete, another replied. Kevin's heart pounded as he realized they were talking about him. The cargo he'd hauled across state lines was not just in his trailer, he was the shipment. Inside the facility, Kevin caught glimpses of researchers in lab coats, their faces obscured by masks. He heard his name, not as a person but as a case number. The biological samples he'd delivered weren't research materials. They were crystallized memories, harvested from other drivers. The researchers discussed transferring these memories into new subjects, trading the experiences and skills of truckers as if they were commodities. Kevin was meant to be emptied out, his years of knowledge stripped away and stored for someone else to use. The realization hit hard. He was no longer a driver but a test subject. He overheard a conversation about his progress and the chilling phrase, "Replace the core memories next." Desperation took over. Kevin managed to slip away during a shift change, stumbling out of the facility and driving until the world blurred at the edges. He reached a hospital where doctors found evidence of neurological tampering, patterns in his brain consistent with artificial memory extraction. The proof was undeniable. Federal investigators traced the operation to a network of biotech companies recruiting truckers for fake jobs. The Montana facility was abandoned by the time they arrived, but the evidence remained. Neural interface chairs, logbooks filled with erased names, and the remains of a system designed to harvest and sell the very thing that made drivers who they were. Kevin's ordeal changed the industry. He warned others about suspicious contracts and became a resource for law enforcement, determined to keep other drivers from suffering the same fate. But even as the investigation widened, the sense of unease lingered. The roads had always been lonely, but now, for some, there was the added fear of losing not just their way, but themselves. And for those who think the worst thing that can happen on a delivery is getting lost, there are places where the threat is much more than that. Michael Torres accepted a delivery that took him farther north than any job before, deep into Alaska, where the roads narrow and civilization drops away. The address was a set of coordinates, not a town, and the instructions came with a warning: do not ask questions. The payout was enough to make most drivers ignore their instincts, but as he passed through endless stretches of snow and silent forest, the sense of isolation pressed in. When the facility appeared, it was nothing like any distribution center Michael had seen. Concrete walls rose from the frozen ground, ringed by razor wire and watchtowers. Armed guards watched from behind mirrored glass. The air was sharp with the scent of diesel and cold metal. He was directed to an underground loading dock, his presence barely acknowledged by workers who moved with mechanical precision. The cargo was quickly unloaded, and Michael found himself alone in a dimly lit corridor, waiting for clearance to leave. A hiss of hydraulics drew his attention. Two technicians pushed carts carrying transparent cylinders filled with greenish fluid. Suspended inside were human forms, not quite awake but unmistakably alive. Their faces were blank, features eerily familiar, as if someone had pressed pause on a life. Michael's heart pounded. He'd heard stories of medical research in the far north, but this was something else. He edged closer, careful not to draw attention. Voices echoed from a nearby doorway. "The biological profile's ready for integration," one technician said. "Extraction's next." Another replied, "Truckers are ideal, isolated, transient. They disappear, nobody asks questions." Michael realized the facility wasn't just making clones. It was replacing people, erasing the originals as if they'd never existed. The deeper he ventured, the more the horror became clear. Through reinforced glass, he saw rows of growth chambers stretching into the shadows, each with a body in some stage of development. Crates nearby were labeled with names, dates, and ID numbers, records of people who had been cataloged and replaced. In a storage room, Michael found containers filled with human remains, each tagged with the identity of someone who had once been alive and on the road. The process was systematic and thorough. Once a clone was ready, the original was eliminated. Panic set in as Michael realized his own fate might already be sealed. He retraced his steps, dodging patrols and slipping past security checkpoints. The escape was frantic, a blur of cold air and adrenaline as he forced his truck through the gates and sped away, headlights cutting through the endless dark. In the weeks that followed, Michael tried to warn others. He pieced together reports from families who said their loved ones came home changed, drivers who knew every detail of their routes but seemed off in subtle, chilling ways. Authorities traced the operation to organized crime and shadowy interests, but the facility vanished before it could be raided. The investigation found evidence of similar programs elsewhere, hinting at a network that reached across borders. For Michael, the most disturbing truth lingered. His own clone was likely still out there, driving the same roads, carrying his memories, answering to someone else. The reach of this operation went beyond any one driver. It threatened the trust that holds the entire industry together, turning the open road into a place where even your own reflection might not be your own. In the face of such hidden dangers, truckers became more than just workers. They became the first line of defense against forces determined to reshape the world from the shadows. Every mile on the highway holds stories that stretch beyond routine deliveries, stories of unsung frontline heroes facing the unknown, often without recognition or thanks. These accounts are not just chilling tales. They are real warnings, passed down from drivers who have survived encounters most can't even imagine. Within the trucking community, loyalty runs deep, and sharing these experiences is a way to protect each other from the dangers that don't make it onto any map. Share your own unexplainable road stories below to help warn and protect your fellow drivers. Subscribe for more verified accounts, because the road still holds secrets we're only beginning to uncover.